Would you like to accelerate your career and reach your full potential in just minutes a day? Welcome to the LEADx Show with New York Times best-selling author and Inc. 500 entrepreneur, Kevin Kruse.
What are the ABCs of persuading, convincing, and influencing others? Welcome, everyone. Kevin Kruse here. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about the surprising truth about persuading others. But first, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at leadx.org. Each super short issue has actionable tips to advance your career and to fulfill your potential. Visit leadx.org. Our guest today has been named as one of the top 10 business thinkers in the world. His TED Talk on motivation has been viewed over 17 million times. He's the author of 5 best-selling books, including A Whole New Mind, Drive, and To Sell is Human. Our guest, of course, is Daniel Pink. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you on. Now, my opening hook, how was it? It was in the form of a question. It was specific. It tickled curiosity. Did I sell the show?
Totally. I'm in.
You're sticking around. You want to know the answers.
Absolutely. I will not be leaving the show before you.
We're going to talk about To Sell is Human in just a minute. But I always start off with a question that our listeners are always eager to hear about. It's related to work-life balance. And Dan, you always thank your family at the end of your books. I know you have 3 kids. You always thank your wife, Jessica. Maybe you can give us a glimpse into the Pink family and how you keep it all together.
Well, thanks for assuming that I keep it together. I think like a lot of people, it's barely staying together. One small move and everything can go flying out of control. I have been self-employed for coming up on 20 years, 19 and a half years as we talk right now. And my oldest kid is 20. So my kids have no recollection of me having a real job. But it's still, so what we've done, so in earlier on in those first 20 years, I don't remember the exact number, but 10 plus, I worked on the 3rd floor of our house. And that was okay. It wasn't great. It was, I think, a little too tightly connected between, work and family. Then we moved and I upgraded to a garage. So I work now, Pink Inc. World Headquarters is the garage behind our house here in Washington, D.C. It is a 22-step commute from my back door of the house to the front door of the office. And I have to say, that kind of soft separation works really, really well, I think. When I had an office on the 3rd floor of our house, I couldn't really have people to my office, hey, come over and talk to, because they'd have to traipse through my house and step on kids' toys and whatever. And so this, I got a separate entrance. It's removed. I very rarely take my laptop in from the office to the house. So that kind of soft separation at least has worked really well for me. It took me a while, over a decade, to kind of pull it off, but that's how I sort of managed to keep it under control.
Just as a follow-up, I know you're on the road a lot, doing talks all around the world. You've said you've got 3 kids, different ages.
Yeah.
Maybe it's easier now that they're older, but any tricks for keeping in touch with the family for the road warriors out there?
That's a great question. I really think that things like Skype video and FaceTime have been really useful in that regard. I mean, it's obviously not a replacement for being with your family, but I find it better than a regular phone call. And so I think that helps a little bit. The other thing that helps is that, I do have to travel somewhat, but when I don't travel, I'm here, and so, literally, my family can look out the back window and see whether I'm in my office. Literally, my kids will come and, knock on the office door, the garage door, and, come in and say, hey, I'm working on this essay about such and such. Can I ask you a question? And, and I'll, of course, will spring up to the whiteboard in the office. So, for road war, I think a lot of the challenge with road warriors is what are you doing when you're not on the road? And if you're on the road all the time and when you're not on the road, you're in some faraway office, I think it can be really, really hard on the family. So I don't think there's an easy solution in that regard too. I think that the best thing to do is have a very tolerant, supportive spouse.
Yeah, that's got to be the number one key, I'm sure. Your most recent book is To Sell is Human, The Surprising Truth About Moving Others. LEADx listeners, I want to emphasize that this isn't a classic sales book. It's about moving others. We're all in sales. It's really a book about persuasion, which is a personal passion of mine. I don't know why, but it's a topic that's always fascinated me. We'll start at, I guess, answering the teaser that I kicked the podcast off with, Dan. You say the ABCs of selling's no longer about closing, which was what the old adage was, always be closing, but it's about something else. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the why before the what here. So, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that's happened the most important thing that's happened in the world of persuasion, selling, whatever, is that most of what we know about sales, certainly, and persuasion, has come from a world of information asymmetry, where the seller always had more information than the buyer. And almost any kind of, we can talk about selling per se, any kind of sales transaction, the seller had more information than the buyer. It didn't matter whether you were some peasant selling a goat to somebody who wanted to buy your goat. You knew more about the goat than the person buying it. It didn't matter whether you were selling a car in B2B. There was information asymmetry in the sales relationship. However, in the last 10 years, so quickly that I think a lot of us really haven't quite understood how important it is, that information asymmetry has begun to shift, and it's something closer to information parity, where sellers and buyers are evenly matched. In the world of information asymmetry, always be closing, it might not be noble, but it's a pretty smart idea because the seller has an advantage. But the seller no longer has an advantage. And so the new ABCs, if you look at the social science on how to be persuasive in a world of information parity, the new ABCs are these three qualities that seem to be necessary to be persuasive on this remade landscape. They are A, attunement, get out of your own head into someone else's head. B, buoyancy, can you stay afloat in what one salesperson calls the ocean of rejection? And C is clarity. Can you go from accessing information to curating it? Can you go from solving existing problems to identifying hidden problems? And it turns out that those three qualities are really what are the make or break qualities if you're trying to persuade anybody in a meeting, in a sales call, to your boss, in this world where information is more fairly distributed.
Yeah, that's interesting, Dan. And I'm glad you started us with the why. And I'd also like to just reinforce that point about information asymmetry. Many listeners will remember that I ran an HR software startup for about 5 years. And even though you would think that I had more information about the product I was selling, this HR software, doesn't really matter what it was, but what I found was the people I was selling to, they actually often had more information than I did, because not only did they have everything that I gave them about my own solution, they had all the information from our competitors, which of course I didn't see. And while I was wearing many different hats in an entrepreneurial role, they were VP of HR and they knew their own workflow obviously better than I could. They knew everything about their internal systems and I didn't. So I think it's a great point. There's some things out there that are purely transactional sales still. And I know even those that are that in this information age, the buyer just has as much information, if not more, than the seller.
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and I think a lot of times when people who aren't in sales sometimes think of sales only as business to consumer, B2C, but a huge amount of sales is B2B, and the changes in B2B sales is phenomenal, as you're suggesting there. I mean, one of the most important things happening in B2B sales is that customers, prospects are coming into the sales process way later in the game, because they can accumulate and collect so much information on their own. And so I actually think that B2B sales has become essentially a form of management consulting rather than a sales job. So what you have to do what you had to do, I hate to put words in your mouth, although I'm about to, or thoughts in your head, but what people in the position that you're talking about, where you're making sales, you have a piece of enterprise software and you're making sales calls on people inside of a company. You have to know their company, their industry inside and out. You have to say, this is why this particular product is going to make I understand your business and your industry. Here are some of the things that you need, and here's how my solution fits that. And it makes the sales process different. It makes the skills that you need very, very different. And as I said, I think in B2B sales, especially at the higher up you go, is now a form of management consulting rather than a form of selling.
Absolutely. Taking this, we've gone B2C to B2B, and I'll even go up one more macro level.
Okay.
You talk about Reagan's famous question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Mm-hmm. You're talking about the power of different types of pitches. And we just had a presidential election. You're in Washington, D.C. right now. You used to be a speechwriter for Al Gore. What was your thoughts about the messaging in the last election? Because, some people are just saying it really shows sort of the extreme divide in our country. But others, including notably Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoonist, he's saying, Trump is a master persuader. This was all about Trump's persuasion skills, and they were totally different and on a higher level than Hillary Clinton's. What's your take on that?
Oh man, yeah. I think that's a tough one. And both of those points that you mentioned, to my mind, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I think they both could be true. Certainly, in this country, we have a very, very divided country right now. I mean, it's extraordinary, and it's been the case for a very long time. We basically have half the country, with one point of view, and half the country with another point of view. And what's a little bit scary about that is that there isn't even you can have disagreements with people on kind of solutions and approaches, and should government do more and should government do less. But what we don't have now is we don't even have consensus really on some of the underlying facts on what truth is, and that's an incredibly dangerous environment. I think it's very, very hard to persuade people in that kind of environment. And maybe Trump did a decent job in that his message was so unbelievably simple. And I don't mean that in a derisive way at all. I mean, there's plenty. I'm not a Trump fan, to put it mildly, but I think there's a power to simplicity. And when Trump was running, people knew exactly what he stood for and what he was going to do as president. I don't think the same thing is true with Clinton. And I think that was another thing that contributed to it. But this was such a wacky election season. I'm loath to come up with a single unified theory of what happened.
Hopefully I'm not stretching it too much, but I do see elements that you said, the simpler the message, and again, your work showing the power of specificity, giving people something to latch onto, and maybe even there's an attunement thing there that many of us just weren't attuned to what was going on in a certain part of our country.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. It's hard for me to disentangle the quote unquote messaging from the content of the message and the integrity of the messenger. But if I can do that, if I can sort of put myself in that position, there is something. People knew where the guy stood, and they knew what he was going. They knew in his early days in office he was going to get rid of Obamacare. He was going to build a wall to keep Mexicans from coming illegally to this country. He knew that he was going to do something to Muslims. Now we can say I think some of those things are actually reprehensible, but they're clear. And I think with Hillary Clinton, I don't think that anybody knew what she was going to do in her first day in office. So I do think that there was there's a persuasive lesson in there. Simplicity and repetition are very powerful persuasive tools. That said, I don't think that Trump is anywhere close to Reagan as a talented persuader.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you there. So to change to perhaps a lighter topic, we're speaking on a Thursday, so I'm going to go ahead and do the Throwback Thursday.
Oh, wow.
In the spirit of Johnny Bunko and Free Agent Nation.
Holy moly. All right.
Let's offer some career advice. A little bit of this is inside baseball. Dan, let's say one of my listeners out there today is a 33-year-old attorney or speechwriter, and she decides she wants to throw it all away and become a professional writer, a professional speaker, just like you. What advice would you give to her today? What would increase her odds of success?
Well, I would want to know why she's doing it. And number one, the other thing that would dramatically increase her odds would be to spend some time with people who have done something like that, ask them questions, try to learn from their mistake. There's a principle in social psychology called surrogation, where you can actually make better decisions and better predictions if you talk to people who have done what you are planning to do. So one might have some assumptions about what it's like to be a writer, and they're probably wrong. And so what I would suggest to her is go out and find 5 writers, however you can find them, and say, what's it really, really like? So that's what I would suggest. Number 2, I would suggest that it's a little bit counterintuitive. I would suggest that she should be slightly risk averse about doing that. That is, she should try to hedge her bets on that. So one thing to do would be to maybe start writing, if you want to say write journalistic articles, newspaper, magazine articles for web publications. Maybe don't give up your day job, but do that on the side and see what it's like.
Did you follow your own current advice back when you made the leap?
Absolutely.
Did you have some mentors?
I think that's a great question, Kevin, and I think it's a great check when anybody gives you advice is to say, did you follow that advice? I mean, I really do. I think it's really important. And what I did is I didn't do a lot of the surrogation. I did a little bit of it, but I certainly did not make a big jump. In fact, mine was in some ways the opposite. The fact that I was spending so much time writing articles on the side while doing other jobs after literally 10 years was a hint to me that maybe what I was doing on the side should be what I was doing for real. And when I went out on my own, again, I'm married. I was married when I'm still married to the same person, fortunately. I was married when I went out on my own. My wife did not leave her job, all right? She kept her job as another kind of a hedge. And I also, even though I knew that I wanted to write under my own byline, write my own stuff, because I had experience with a speechwriter, I did a little speech writing to bring some money in as another kind of hedge. And so for her, I would say, if you happen to be married, don't have your spouse give up their day job, because that's another way to hedge. The other thing is maybe in your early days, if you're really committed to going out on your own, maybe what you should do is, definitely write what you want to write, but to bring some money in, maybe you want to spend, a fourth of your time, a fifth of your time, one day a week, doing a little bit of legal practice, helping out a client. So see what it's really like, and be a smart risk taker. Be a smart risk taker. Don't resist taking a risk. But most of the people who I know who made this work, have not been wild and woolly risk takers. They've been strategic risk takers.
Great. Hedge the risk.
Yeah.
When it comes to building your brand over time, I noticed that you do something that I don't see too many other authors doing. You actually put your email address in the back of all your books.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how much email do you get, and do you actually get a chance to respond to it all?
Okay. So this is either a really good idea, Kevin, or a really bad idea. And depending on what day you talk to me, I'll give you a different answer. I do get a lot of email from readers, and it is extremely helpful. A lot of it is extremely helpful. And I actually try to answer every single piece of email. I don't always answer it, obviously, that day. I often will batch it. So I'll do, a batch of 35 or 40, that I keep in an email folder, every few days or so. But I try to answer it all. And I think that it is, even though, it might read on the outside, so, oh, my God, what a nice guy. He's putting his email address. He's either, he's either a nice guy, or he's insane, or he's full of it. He must not be real. But what people don't realize is no, it's actually, there's a lot of self-interest in that. So for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So I've had plenty of readers find typos or drop words in a text, and we've gone back and fixed them in subsequent editions. That's pretty amazing,
Crowdsourced editorial. I like that.
Bingo. That's exactly what it is. Another thing is that readers ask questions, and a lot of readers ask really, really good questions. Why didn't you write about this? Why didn't you write about that? So there are many examples of that. So for Drive, I actually had to keep the book at a reasonable length. I cut out, I won't get into the whole boring stuff here, but I cut out a few pages that had to do a little bit more with the history of psychology and some other figures in psychology who had ideas about motivation. I actually cut those thinking, you know what, no one really cares. They just want to get to the main point. And then I had readers come in and say, why didn't you mention Hertzberg? Why didn't you mention so-and-so? And I was like, okay, you know what? I guess I was wrong. I guess I made a bad call. And I went back, and in the paperback edition, went to my old file where I had those paragraphs and put them back in. You have people who, one reason, so I wrote a book called Drive about the science of motivation. And one of the questions that I got, about Drive, literally from the first week, I don't think it was the first email that I got, but it was in the first week was, well, this is really interesting. You're saying that certain kinds of things don't motivate people to do great work. What about sales? What about sales commissions?
Oh, wow.
And I was like, that's a freaking good question. What about sales commissions? And I started thinking about that and interviewing people about that. And that's one of the things that got me on the whole topic of sales. So reader emails helped me figure out the next topic. So there's, I really think that in the media world that we live in now, especially for writers, it has to be a conversation. It can't be this, with very few exceptions, it can't be this one way, here I am on the mountaintop preaching to all of you great unwashed readers in hopes of saving you. It doesn't work that way. I really think it has to be a conversation. And the great thing about that is that conversations are richer. People will tell you where you're wrong. People will tell you what mattered to them. People will tell you, in A Whole New Mind, for instance, one of the things that really surprised me early on in the book was, again, in the early days, I started hearing from educators. It wasn't a book for educators. It was a business book. And I started hearing from educators. And it's like, whoa, wait a second. This is really interesting. Maybe I should, write some other things about education because it seems like educators are interested in this in a way that surprised me. So I forgive the long answer, but it's, I really think that anybody who wants to do what, you and I do, you have to think of it as a conversation, not as I'm broadcasting my brilliant thoughts and you will sit there and passively listen to them.
No, I appreciate you spending as much time on it as you did. I talk a lot about the power of intimate attention. And even though we have all this social media, most social media isn't very social. No. Everybody's broadcasting.
Exactly.
To actually receive a reply to an individual email or to take that question and answer in a video or something, there's an intimacy there that I think hopefully it's helping someone and making an honest connection. And then, as you said, there's a lot of self-interest. It's a great way to build a brand.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it is both the right thing to do and it's good business. I really do. And so, on the right thing to do part, I've got, there are people out there who have spent, let's say just for a paperback book, one of my books, they spent, $12 and 7 hours of their time on something that I did. Okay, I can give them 3 or 4 minutes. That's the right thing to do. Second of all, it's just good business because, someone who asks me a question and gets an email back, someone who has bought one of my books is about 350 times more likely to buy the next one than someone who hasn't. Someone who has bought one of my books, sent me an email and received a reply is about 3,000 times more likely to buy a book than somebody else. So it's one of those things where, somewhat rare in life, where smart business and being a good person, I think, are really converge.
You're talking about the book business, and the next topic, I happen to actually see an announcement on Publishers Marketplace about your next book. Are you in a position where you can announce what it is yet?
I mean, it's out there. I mean, I'm writing a book about timing. We all say that, everybody says timing is everything, but a lot of our timing decisions are a lot of what I call our when decisions. When should you fire somebody? When should you quit a job? When should you go out on your own, as you were asking before? We tend to think that's much more of an art, intuition, and there's actually a rich science on timing that you can use to make better decisions. So I'm talking about everything from like when during a day should you exercise? When during your day should you do kind of careful heads down work? When during a day should you do your creative work? Why should you never, ever, if you can avoid it, go into a hospital in an afternoon? Why do kids who, in standardized tests do worse when they take the test in the afternoon than in the morning? All right. How is that distorting our? Why do school days for high school kids? Why do school days start so early? What happens at the midpoint of things? Why do sometimes midpoints bum us out, and why do sometimes midpoints fire us up so that NBA teams that are down by 1 at halftime are actually more likely to win than teams that are up by 1? How do beginnings affect us? How do midpoints end us? How do endings affect us? How do we synchronize our action in time? Why does thinking about the past make us behave one way, thinking about the future makes us behave another way? So a whole deep dive, and right now a very messy dive, into the science of timing and how you can use it to live better and work smarter.
I love that. Listeners, notice how Dan just stacked all these curiosity questions one after another to entice us. We cannot wait for this book. I'm very excited by that. Dan, before I go, I like to challenge our listeners to get 1% better every day.
Okay.
Is there some kind of activity or exercise that you want to ask them to do today?
Sure. I mean, I love stuff like that, and I'm totally with you, Kevin, on the theory of the case there. That like getting like small. I'm just a huge believer in small steps and steady progress rather than these giant leaps. I just don't think giant leaps happen all that much. And so I just totally endorse your underlying theory. There are all kinds of things. I'll tell you two of my very favorites. Or you asked for one, I'll give you two. Two of my very favorites. One of them is what I didn't come up with any of these. One of them is something called the MIT. All right, the MIT, the most important task. All right, and so what I do is I have in my office here. We're not on video, so you can't see me actually pointing at it, but I'll point at it anyway, just because I have a little whiteboard here, and I always write down each morning, what's my MIT? What's the most important task that I have to do that day? I write it up there and make sure I do that before I do anything else. Okay? No checking email, no doing this, everything, because it's easy to feel busy, but not effective. And, you're more likely to, 10 years from now, you're much more likely to be proud of what you initiated rather than what you responded to. And so by putting that MIT up on the board every day, I look at that and say, you know what? I'm not going to reply to that email yet because I haven't hit my MIT. That's one thing. The second thing is from David Allen, the founder of Getting Things Done. I'm a big Getting Things Done devotee. And what David has recommended, and I love, is something called the 2-minute rule, which is that if you can get something done in 2 minutes, do it now. So assuming I've hit my MIT, if I had, so for instance, I had to have my wife sign a tax form, okay, literally today, okay, and so it was sitting on my desk, and I said, you know what, it's going to take me 30 seconds, less than 30 seconds to walk into the house and have her sign this. So I can either have it sitting on my desk this afternoon, staring at me, waiting for me to do this, or if it's going to take me 30 seconds, I'm just going to do it now, have her sign it, and get it over with. So if it takes less than 2 minutes, do it now. And that just frees up a lot of mental space.
Love those productivity tips. I'm such a fanatic about the most important task concept, Dan, that in 2015, I commissioned a study, about 10,000 people.
Really?
And those who had their daily MIT identified, not only did they report being more productive, they reported higher levels of quality of life and more energy. Those who had an MIT correlated to a feeling of more energy.
Are you serious? Wow.
Yeah, really life-changing.
That's fascinating. Yeah, no, that's great to hear. That makes perfect sense to me. It just makes perfect sense to me because I know the days. This is always a struggle, at least for me, and I think it's a struggle for a lot of writers because writing is really freaking hard. And even if you've been doing it for a long time, every single day, at least for me, is hard. And there are all these kinds of things that in the short term are easier than writing, that give the illusion of getting stuff done. Answering email, putting up a few tweets, filling out some tax forms, ba-ba-da-ba-ba-dee-ba. And yet, when the days when I beat the resistance, to use Stephen Pressfield's wonderful phrase, all right? The days when I basically give the finger to the resistance and keep it outside of my door, I feel more energetic myself. I feel higher levels of subjective well-being. I can go back and enjoy things with my family. I'm less stressed out. And so I think it's a great, you and I can be the two-person hallelujah chorus for the MIT.
Hallelujah. Dan, what's the best way our listeners can keep track of all that you're doing and find out when your next book is out?
You can go to danpink.com, danpink.com. I've got a bunch of resources and things that people can use, videos and a couple of good PDFs on tools and tips, so they can check that out. And then I also have an email newsletter. It's another great way to stay in contact with people.
Great. All right, friends, you've just been mentored by none other than Dan Pink. You get all the links and show notes from this interview over at leadx.org. Before you go, if you've gotten even one new idea from this show, Dan dropped so many value bombs, I'm sure you got at least one. Take a minute and just leave a 1 or 2 sentence review over on iTunes or Stitcher, because the more reviews a podcast gets, the more likely it is that iTunes will show it off to other people. Until next time, remember, leadership is not about authority. You don't need a title to lead. Leadership is influence. We are all leaders whether we want to be or not. The question is, what kind of leader will you be?